Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Ink and Bourbon. This is Patrick Leclerc. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about diversity in fantasy and science fiction, and more specifically, the reaction to diversity in fantasy and science fiction, and what that says about you as a person, how you view this diversity. A lot of stuff's been said about this lately. And recently I made the mistake of going on Twitter and getting involved in trolling through the comments of some posts on specifically the later Star Wars, and now the Star Wars was brought up, Captain Marvel was brought up, She-Hulk was brought up, and then some other people were talking about the Rings of Power. And there's a lot of angry fan reaction to these. And I think we need to look at this objectively. I'm a white guy in my 50s. I grew up on fantasy. I read all the old school fantasy, and I saw Star Wars when I was like the original Star Wars in the theater when I was 7 or 8 years old, and I grew up with all this, and I treasure the old stories. So I understand nostalgia, but the reactions are kind of off-putting, and you need to look at why you might feel that way. One of the things that I kept hearing about, I'm going to use a couple examples. This isn't really scripted. I'm going to kind of go off because I was reading stuff and it bothered me. So I'm going to come on the internet and bitch about it because that's what we do, I guess. So one of the big claims against some of the female heroines of the more recent fantasy and science fiction movies have been that they're a Mary Sue, and I don't like that term. I don't think it means what you think it means, as Inigo Montoya would have said. So I'm going to use the example of Star Wars. In the later 3 movies, starting with Force Awakens, our protagonist is Rey. And there's been many people have said how she's a Mary Sue and she's good at everything and she just accomplishes things with very little effort. And she doesn't train. And Luke, on the other hand, earned his heroism. And you're just wrong. Let's examine this for a moment. Now, I was 8 years old when I watched Star Wars. Star Wars was great. I understand it's a cultural touchstone of our generation. And I'm not going to say bad things about it. But if you look at Luke's journey, Luke is a farm boy being raised by relatives on not by his actual parents. His parents are gone. They're out of the picture. He's being raised on a distant planet far from the center of everything. At a very menial, a very low status job. He's a farmer. He's not a diplomat. He's not a soldier. He's not a pilot. He's a farmer. And in the first movie, over the course of a very short time, days, maybe a week, from when he finds a holographic message in a droid, he goes from a farm boy to, leaving his home, going on a mission with a mentor who explains to him about the Force, and he winds up performing a rescue mission on a highly guarded, impregnable military base, ship, whatever you want to call the Death Star, military installation. And in the course of that rescue, he proves himself to be a combat sharpshooter. During the escape, he suddenly transforms into an expert ball turret gunner, fighting off the TIE fighters that pursue the Millennium Falcon away. They bring the plans for the Death Star to the rebels, and then all of a sudden he's suddenly a fighter pilot that joins the assault. In fact, he's out of most of the squadron that gets wiped out, he's one of the few survivors, and he's the guy that actually fires the shot that destroys the Death Star. In like maybe a week ago, he was a farmer. And that's fine because it's hero's journey and it fits and it tracks. It requires a lot of suspension of disbelief, but that's okay because that's what this story is. It's a mashup of everything great. It's a samurai space western war movie, infiltration, action adventure. It's everything George Lucas thought was cool when he was a kid, and he put it all in there, and he wrapped it up in that Destiny hero's journey thing, and it works. The same way that King Arthur is raised with no knowledge of what he is, and then all of a sudden he proves his worthiness when he pulls a sword out of a stone. Luke has no idea of his destiny or his abilities until he runs into Obi-Wan and he gets this explanation and he goes on this journey and he discovers his abilities with the Force. And I'm willing to go along for that ride. I'm willing to believe that you can take a crop duster and it's the same as if we took a guy who was a crop duster living in Kansas on a farm, and suddenly the country's under threat, so they throw him in an F-18 and send him off to destroy an enemy installation. It's fine because of the story it is. It's a fantasy, hero's journey, it works. I'm okay with that. We were all okay with it. Everybody in Gen X was okay with it. When we saw it, we loved it, we cheered, we thought it was terrific. But then those same people who were okay with that have a problem with a young person who lives on a desert planet out in the middle of nowhere, who over the course of one film runs into some people who let her in on some secrets, and suddenly she's using the Force and she's conducting an infiltration mission and showing herself to be really skilled at combat and a great pilot and helping to destroy an enemy installation. And if you are okay with one instance of this and not okay with the other instance of this, you have to look at it. I'm not trashing Luke's journey. I'm not trashing the hero's journey. That's a thing. And you can like it or you can not like it. But what you really shouldn't do is like the hero's journey and be okay with it unless that hero, you don't feel that they can accomplish it lugging around those big heavy ovaries. And that's kind of what this is feeling like. Name three other differences. On the comments, I had Luke's struggle explained to me in painful detail. We spent years training as a Jedi under Yoda. The first movie, he spent 4 days. He spent about an hour with Obi-Wan playing with the remote trainer with his lightsaber, which had never been used in the movie. But suddenly, like I said, he lands on the Death Star, and he's able to, he suddenly turns into a commando who can wipe out stormtroopers, escapes, turns into a gunner who can shoot down TIE fighters. And then, yes, he was a pilot who could, bullseye womp rats in Beggar's Canyon. But now he's a pilot flying a state-of-the-art military fighter craft and destroying an enemy installation, death machine. And that's, again, I was okay with that movie. But you should be okay with that journey when someone else does it. Now, I'm not defending this isn't discussing a whole movie. I'm not going to tell you that Force Awakens was as good as the original Star Wars or that it was better, or that it was... I'm talking about the journey of the two protagonists, and they're about as parallel as you can get. But, one suddenly got a lot more love than the other, and one got a lot more hate than the other, and that's just not right. And if you feel that way, you really should ask yourself why. I'm going to touch on Captain Marvel really quickly. A lot of the thing I saw with Captain Marvel, people didn't like her because she was a cocky fighter pilot who, didn't have a journey where she got better. She just started at the beginning as a cocky fighter pilot and ended up as a cocky fighter pilot. Overcame some personal stuff in between, but didn't have a training montage where she suddenly learned to fight better. And she comes into her own and saves the day at the end. And if you don't like that, that's fine. But tell me how that's different from the original Top Gun that we all loved in the 80s. The only place that I think Captain Marvel really doesn't compare well to Top Gun is it doesn't have a really great homoerotic beach volleyball scene like Top Gun did, which that makes it objectively a worse movie than Top Gun. But character-wise, if you're okay with Maverick being a cocky fighter pilot who's full of himself from the beginning of the movie, and you're not okay with Carol Danvers being a cocky fighter pilot who's full of herself from the beginning of the movie, maybe you need to ask yourself why. And lastly, I'm going to come to Rings of Power. So, trying to expand bring to the screen some of the background of Tolkien's Middle-earth. We saw, Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and now Amazon has bought the rights to do, a cinematic adaptation of some of the earlier stuff, some of the earlier stories, and the background of the world, and some of the legends. And it's largely stuff from the Silmarillion. Now, Silmarillion was not published during Tolkien's lifetime. He wrote a lot of bits and pieces, and they've been collated and edited and published by his son later on. And there's a handful of books now, not just Silmarillion, but Unfinished Tales and a lot of things that would inform Tolkien's world that Hobbit and Lord of the Rings take place in. But again, they're fairly incomplete. There's gaps, there's bits and pieces. And there's places where it's definitely almost necessary that another artist would fill in. If you want to tell the story of the origins of Middle-earth, it's not all there. It's not complete chapter and verse set out in prose. There's bits and pieces that are written in detail, and there's long swaths that are just described. And some of his notes contradict earlier notes. So there's going to be some filling in. And as usual, the fans were upset at some of the ways that this was filled in. And it falls back to a large extent, you can dislike an adaptation of a story you liked. You can think it's not true to the author's vision. That's fine. But ask yourself what bothers you about it. And the idea of, well, dwarves can't be black. Why? Why is that a deal breaker? Why? We know Middle-earth was vast and had different cultures because we see, even in the glimpses that we have that are canon, that are set down, that Tolkien nailed to the floor, the things from Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings that were published and are out there and are canon, there's a lot of different cultures in Middle-earth. There are different races in Middle-earth, and different... We use race as elves versus hobbits versus dwarves, but I'm talking about differences within that. The men of certain areas are described as more fair or more dark-skinned or whatever. So we know that there are a variety of people in Middle-earth. And the idea that they wouldn't migrate and they wouldn't intermix and that there wouldn't be differences is really kind of ridiculous. So on that end, you don't even really have a good argument. And again, it's trying to cloak views that you might not be proud of in a pseudoscientific argument. And I think that's where we got to come down to this. Again, I'm in my mid-50s. I'm a white guy. I've been reading fantasy my whole life. I know that a lot of the early stuff was written by middle-aged white guys. I've never had to lack for heroes that look like me. Well, they're maybe a little younger and not as fat, not as short. But I've always had examples. Now that other people are getting examples where there are more female heroes, more heroes of color, more, black superheroes and Hispanic characters and Asian characters, it's not taking away from me. It's giving other people something that they can identify with and look up to. Just because somebody else is getting to enjoy fantasy isn't taking it away from me. And I think we have to realize that. And I think we have to look at that and ask ourselves, why does it bother you that somebody else is getting something that we've had all along? And I think that if you ask yourself that question, you really look inside, it's uncomfortable. But I think sometimes we need to face that uncomfortableness because that's your struggle. And from what we've heard, without your struggle, I guess you're a Mary Sue. So, in short, don't be that guy. Let fantasy be fantasy. Look at it with an open mind. If somebody wants, to do a different take, don't hate it out of hand. And don't find a reason don't look for a reason to look down on a female superhero or a Asian superhero. Or, oh my God, can we have black stormtroopers and black dwarves? And how can we have that? Well, you know what? It's space. There can be anything we want in space. There can be anything we want in a fantasy world. Open up and roll with things a little bit. Let people have the same representation that we've had all along. All right? And again, I think there's too much reaction to all of this. I think we need to call it out for what it is. It's, and maybe it's unconscious, maybe it's subliminal, but it's a lot of racism and sexism that doesn't need to be there. And I think we can be better than that. We're supposed to be looking at stories about heroes who stand up and do the right thing. Well, you know what? Stand up and do the right thing. If you see injustice, call it out. And I think that's what we got to do. All right? So, in short, if you don't like something, that's fine. But ask yourself why you don't like it. And if you don't like it for the wrong reasons, maybe examine that. All right? So just be a little more self-aware and do the work. All right. Thanks very much. If you like this, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Feel free to like it. I'm not going to fight with you in the comments on this one. I'm just saying that because it's the internet and I expect it. Feel free to comment. I'm not going to get in fistfights with you on that. So just be better, everybody. All right. Thanks very much. Hopefully see you later with some more content next week. Thanks. Bye-bye.